Alright folks, my name is Freyn, and today I'm going to be taking a deep dive into character speed. If you were unaware, by default neither characters nor tames can have their speed leveled in ASA, and this obviously changes things a little for foot-based travel. To take a closer look into how movement now measures up, I'll be dividing this into three main topics. How fast is default compared to ASE, how can you increase your mobility, and what can catch you. As always, if you find this helpful, I hope you'll consider leaving a like, subscribing or sharing around, but for now, let's get cracking, shall we? Since the start of ASA, I've seen a lot of discussion about the idea that the default movement speed is now higher than it once was to compensate for that lack of speed leveling, but we don't have any concrete figures in the game to tell us this. The easiest way to determine, of course, would be to pull the numbers directly out of the dev kit, but at a hefty 290GB for the ASA kit and a further 400 plus for the ASE, not to mention the games themselves of course, that's not really an option for me here. So instead I've built this 50 foundation long track, and we're simply going to run them side by side and see which one gets to the end first and by how big of a difference. And they are lining up pretty much spot on. There is obviously a little difference in the camera perspective between the games, especially due to slightly different character heights, but they are crossing those wooden foundations at the exact same time. And while here it may look a little different because of the slightly different stance in the character, I've stopped it when I perceive the centre of mass to have crossed the end of that foundation, and that is dead on, maybe a few frames out. So there is absolutely no difference between the movement speed of the two games. I guess we all simply got so used to leveling our movement speed that we completely forgot what the default was like. And well, now that we know this, we can move on to section 2. What can we do to increase our mobility? Well, if you have a need for speed and have the time to do some cooking, you can make yourself some focal chili, which will boost you by 25% for 15 minutes. There's also Battle Tartar with a massive 50% speed boost for 3 minutes at the cost of a constant health drain. And most surprisingly, infecting yourself with swamp fever from a diseased leech will give you an additional 20% until cured, although at the cost of reduced weight, damage, health and stamina. Now obviously we already have some numbers right there, but a visual comparison is pretty nice to have, so let's do another sprint test, shall we? Comparing the default, chili, tartar, fever, and a combination of them all. Again, we already know what to expect for the most part here, but the interesting one to watch is the combined. The tartar seems to override the chili, probably because they're both foods, but it seems to stack with the fever, giving us a 70% boost over the default. Now, some things may look a touch off here due to more lean in the stances, or simply frames not being able to keep up, but all camera angles are identical and the tracks match at the end, which is the key to ensuring that the test is valid. But if you want a good speed boost, getting tartar and fever is clearly the way, although likely not for very long, given all the negative effects that come with it, with chili being the only totally positive option. Of course, this is all well and good and we all like to go faster, but how much faster is actually necessary? Which brings us on to part 3. What can catch you? There are a few ways to try and answer this question, spawning in creatures and simply trying to run being the most obvious and bloody way to test, but we're aiming for the most concrete and fair way we can here. We want as few variables as we can get, eliminating terrain completely, making sure every test is identical, and ideally being visually clean as well without any sort of camera awkwardness. So we're going to strip it right back to basics and do a side view track like this. Now hopefully this will let us see any differences in speed immediately and more importantly clearly. And now all we've got to do is run this against a selection of the more aggressive creatures of the island. Obviously no point running against the really slow ones or things that aren't particularly going to chase you. But let's begin. And there we go, one hopefully useful guide on what creatures you can escape from and under what conditions. It's not a complete list of course, but I think it fairly well covers the majority of the more dangerous and speedy of the island's fauna. Obviously there are some notable omissions like the alphas or the bosses, and I did really want to try and include those, but unfortunately the alphas just didn't seem to be properly applying their buff, and for the bosses movement was often a challenge at all. Now outside of that, there was certainly some curious results when comparing the creatures to either my own in-game experiences or even just the raw numbers the kit was giving me. It's likely this is possibly just down to my inexperience with the kit, but having run through multiple different methods of testing for some of the creatures, the results have at the very least been consistent. So if there are errors, it's theoretically due to a mismatch in behaviour of the kit and the game instead. Now obviously I'd rather use the game where possible, but it's simply not a controllable enough environment to get consistent data, and we also lack that lovely third-person camera I was able to use. If you've made it this far though, thank you very much for watching. This has been easily the biggest and lengthiest project I've undertaken yet. It's been weeks of learning the dev kit, over 60 hours of recording and editing, an absurdly complex timeline, and an entire day of rendering. I would like to have included more creatures in it, but it simply wasn't feasible at this stage. Perhaps if there's interest I'll do a part 2 of, say, the water creatures, but for now, this is the end. Let me know what you think in the comments, and do please consider liking, subscribing, sharing, or possibly even becoming a member if you're enjoying the content. I'm off to finally get some sleep. I'll see you next time. Bye bye.